Here's a scene that plays out in workplaces, family dinners, and comment sections all over the world right now. A Gen Z employee tells their manager, a Gen Xer in their late 40s, that they need to step away from a project because it's affecting their mental health. The Gen Xer's internal response, which they may or may not say out loud, is something like, I worked a double shift with a broken hand and didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to seem weak. Mental health. Sure. And the Gen Z person, for their part, looks at this Gen Xer, someone who seems allergic to vulnerability, who deflects everything with sarcasm, who appears to have no interest in being understood, and thinks, what is wrong with this person? Why are they like this? Here's what's interesting. They're both right about each other, and they're both completely missing the point. Because Gen X and Gen Z, separated by 30 years, shaped by wildly different historical circumstances, are actually, psychologically speaking, more similar than either of them would ever want to admit. They are both, in their own ways, the misunderstood generations, the ones who got lost in the noise. And understanding why requires going back to what each of them was actually handed when they were growing up. Let's start with Gen X. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, the latchkey generation, the forgotten middle child of American demographic history, sandwiched between the enormous cultural footprint of the boomers before them and the millennials who came after. If the boomers were the protagonist of the 20th century's story, Gen X was the protagonist's younger sibling who never quite got their own chapter. What defined Gen X psychologically wasn't trauma in the dramatic sense. It was a particular flavor of neglect. Not personal neglect necessarily, but structural neglect. These were children whose parents were, in many cases, the first generation of dual-income households, the first to divorce in large numbers, the first to hand children a key and say, "We'll be home by 6, figure it out." Gen X children spent enormous amounts of time unsupervised, unstructured, unobserved. And what that produced, psychologically, was a generation of people who became extraordinarily self-reliant and who learned, quite early, not to expect too much from institutions, authorities, or other people in general. This is where the famous Gen X cynicism comes from. It's not a personality flaw, it's a rational adaptation. When you grow up in an environment where the adults are largely elsewhere, where the news is full of AIDS and nuclear threat and economic recession, where the cultural message is essentially, the future is uncertain and nobody is coming to save you, cynicism isn't pessimism, it's realism. It's the emotional posture of someone who learned early that disappointment is less painful if you don't get your hopes up in the first place. Gen X also came of age in an era before the internet made everything visible and documented. Their adolescence and young adulthood happened in relative privacy. Mistakes were local. Embarrassments were temporary. There was no permanent record, no personal brand to manage, no audience. And this produced a psychological trait that younger generations find genuinely baffling, a deep, almost instinctive comfort with being unnoticed. Gen X doesn't need to be seen. After decades of being overlooked, invisibility stopped being a wound and started feeling like freedom. Now let's talk about Gen Z. Born roughly between 1997 and 2012, the first generation to grow up with smartphones from adolescence, and the psychological profile that has emerged from that childhood is, in certain ways, the mirror image of Gen X, and in other ways, startlingly familiar. Where Gen X was shaped by absence of supervision, of attention, of institutional support, Gen Z was shaped by excess. Excess of information, excess of visibility, excess of awareness. These are children who grew up knowing, in real time, about every global crisis, every social injustice, every mental health statistic. They were handed the full weight of the world's problems via a device in their pocket before their brains had finished developing. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of long-term thinking, emotional regulation, perspective, isn't fully formed until the mid-20s. Gen Z was processing existential-scale information with an adolescent brain. And the anxiety that produced is not weakness, It is the entirely logical response to an entirely illogical situation. But here's where it gets complicated, and where the comparison to Gen X becomes genuinely fascinating. Both generations grew up feeling that the contract was broken. Gen X watched their parents' marriages fall apart, watched corporations downsize without loyalty, watched governments fail to deliver on promises, and concluded that institutions could not be trusted. Gen Z watched the financial crisis erase their parents' security, watched climate change get politicized into inaction, watched social media companies optimize for engagement at the cost of mental health, and reached the same conclusion through different evidence. The cynicism looks different on the surface. Gen X's is wry, dry, delivered with a raised eyebrow and a dark joke. Gen Z's tends to come wrapped in earnestness, in explicit naming of systemic failure, in a directness that older generations experience as aggression. But underneath both is the same wound. We were handed a world that wasn't working, and were told to figure it out. There's a concept in psychology called disillusionment resilience, the capacity to maintain functional engagement with life after your foundational assumptions about how things work have been shattered. Both Gen X and Gen Z have had to develop this in spades, and both have done it, characteristically, in their own way. Gen X developed it through ironic detachment. If you don't take anything too seriously, nothing can truly devastate you. Gen Z has developed it through radical transparency, naming the problem explicitly, building communities around shared acknowledgement of difficulty, refusing to perform wellness they don't feel. One generation learned to hide, the other learned to show. And the irony is that each carries something the other desperately needs. Gen X's capacity for self-reliance, for functioning without external validation, for persisting through difficulty without needing it acknowledged, these are genuine psychological strengths in an uncertain world. Gen Z's capacity for emotional vocabulary, for naming systemic problems instead of just absorbing them silently, for building solidarity around vulnerability, these are also genuine strengths, ones that previous generations, including Gen X, often paid a significant personal price for not having. The tension between these two generations in workplaces and families is, at its core, not really about snowflakes versus slackers. It's about two groups of people who were both failed in different ways, who both developed intelligent adaptations to that failure, and who are now looking at each other's adaptations with suspicion and incomprehension. If you're Gen X and a Gen Z person in your life seems fragile or needy or exhaustingly focused on feelings, consider that they grew up with the volume of the world turned all the way up, with no off switch, and that learning to name what's overwhelming is how they survive it. They're not weaker than you. They just process difficulty out loud instead of in silence. And silence, it turns out, had a cost you may still be paying. If you're Gen Z and a Gen X person in your life seems emotionally closed off or dismissive or allergic to the kind of open conversation you find natural, consider that they learned very young that needing things was dangerous, that vulnerability was punished, that self-sufficiency was the only reliable protection. The wall isn't contempt, it's architecture, built by a child who needed it to survive. Both of you were shaped by a world that wasn't paying enough attention. Both of you found ways to make that workable. And both of you, if you're honest, are still carrying it. That's not a weakness. It's a story worth knowing. Drop a comment. Are you Gen X or Gen Z, and which part of this landed? I genuinely love to hear what resonates and what doesn't. If you're new here, this is what we do. Honest human conversations about the psychology underneath who we are and why. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. See you next time.